The wagon wheels had barely stopped when the voice sliced through the still air. "Get down." Nina Wakasa stared stunned as her stepmother's shadow loomed against the prairie sun. Esther's eyes, always narrow and hard, were shards of cold stone now. She clutched the reins in one hand, a small bundle in the other. The wind whipped the canvas cover of the wagon behind her, snapping like a warning. "I said, get down, now." Nina's legs refused to move. She sat frozen at the edge of the wagon bed, arms wrapped tight around the doll her real mama had sewn from scraps of calico and buttons. The doll's yarn hair was half gone. One eye dangled by a thread. It didn't matter. It was the only thing Nina had left that felt real. "You deaf or just stupid?" Esther snarled, stepping closer. I don't understand," Nina whispered. "You don't need to." Esther threw the bundle at her feet. It thudded against the wood, a torn dress, a tin cup, and a strip of jerky too hard to chew. "I've carried you long enough. You eat what ain't yours. You slow us down. I got no use for dead weight." "But where are we?" Nina's voice was paper thin. "Somewhere off the Bozeman Trail. That's all you need to know." The girl crawled forward on her hands and knees, peering past the tailgate. Grass, yellowed and dry, stretched to the ends of the earth. No people, no wagons, just wind and silence. She looked back toward the driver's seat, hoping for some glimmer of mercy. Esther was already climbing up. "You can't leave me," Nina said, panic bursting loose in her chest. "Please, I'll be quiet. I'll work harder. I'll eat less." "You'll die out here." Esther snapped, voice flat. "But that ain't my problem. Should have died with your daddy." The oxen groaned as Esther cracked the whip. The wagon lurched forward. Nina scrambled toward the wheel, fingers brushing wood, then slipping. "Please." But the wagon didn't stop. Not for her crying. Not for the dust she choked on. Not for the sound of her feet pounding after it until the raw earth burned them bloody. It didn't stop when her voice cracked. It didn't stop when she screamed. "Please, Mama." But that woman wasn't her mama. Had never been her mama. And the word hung empty in the air before falling away. The wagon shrank into the distance, a blot of shadow against a boiling sun. Nina kept running until her legs gave out, and she crumpled in the grass. The wind pulled at her braids and stung her eyes. Her doll lay beside her, half buried in dust. She was 9 years old and alone on the Montana frontier. When the crying stopped, she wasn't sure how long she'd lain there. The sun had shifted west, dragging long shadows across the open land. The Bozeman Trail was somewhere behind her days, maybe. She didn't know how to get back. Didn't know if there was a back to begin with. She sat up slowly. The wind howled across the plain like it was laughing. The prairie didn't care if she lived or died. It had swallowed men, wagons, and children without a trace. Her father used to say it wasn't the mountains or the beasts that killed you. It was the emptiness. "I don't want to die," Nina whispered to the doll, brushing grit from its cloth cheek. "Mama wouldn't want me to die." But Mama was buried 3 years back under a cottonwood near Fort Kearney. Her voice, her songs, her hands gone with the fever. All Nina had left were pieces. She picked up the bundle. Her extra dress was torn and stiff with dirt. The jerky was rock hard. Her stomach twisted, but she couldn't tell if it was hunger or fear. "I have to walk," she told herself. "I have to move. I can't sleep here. Coyotes come at night." The thought dug in sharp. Her father had taught her about coyotes, about cold nights, about not stopping. "North," she whispered. "Trails north." She found faint wagon ruts in the grass and followed them, limping barefoot, every step a sting. The heat clung to her, sucked water from her skin. Her tongue felt like bark. She didn't cry anymore. Crying wasted water. The sun sank lower. Sky turned gold, then deep orange. Her shadow grew long and thin ahead of her. She kept walking. Her thoughts unraveled with each mile. Maybe if she found a wagon train, someone would take her in. Maybe she'd work for food. Maybe someone kind would help. Maybe. Maybe was all she had. Then her foot hit something. A rock. She went down hard knees, scraping dirt, the tin cup flying, the doll tumbling away. Pain shot up her legs. She didn't get up. She just lay there, head on her arms, eyes squeezed shut. This was it. The sun touched the hills. Somewhere a hawk called. She crawled toward her doll and pulled it close. One of its button eyes finally came loose. She tucked it in her pocket with shaking fingers. "I'll fix you," she whispered, "when we're safe." But there was no safe. Her vision blurred, her hands trembled. The earth shifted under her. Then movement. Far off. A figure on a ridge. High above. A horse black as tar with a man on its back. His outline caught the last rays of the sun. He was still watching. Or maybe she imagined him. Maybe this was dying. She blinked, unsure. The figure moved. Her lips parted, too dry to speak. But her heart said, "Don't let him ride away. That ain't a shadow out there, that's a child trying not to disappear." James Coulter lowered the spyglass and stared at the spot on the prairie where the movement had been. The figure was still there, small, stumbling, ragged. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The sun played tricks, especially from the ridge this time of day, but he wasn't mistaken. It was a child, alone. He looked again, adjusting the focus. The figure was walking, or trying to, legs shaky, head bowed. No adult nearby, no wagon, just that tiny form in a too thin dress and what looked like a bundle tied to her side. James swore under his breath and shifted in the saddle. Midnight, his stallion tossed his head, sensing the tension. "You see her too, don't you?" he murmured. The wind whispered back. No answer came, just the rustling grass and a hawk's cry overhead. James pulled back the spyglass, held it to his thigh, and stared down the ridge. He didn't move. Not yet. The land stretched open before him like a mouth waiting to swallow whatever wandered too far. He'd seen death out here more times than he cared to count. A lost child was a funeral in slow motion. He knew what came next if no one stopped it. Heat stroke, night frost, coyotes, or worse, being found by the wrong kind of man. And still he hesitated. He wasn't a rescuer. Not anymore. That part of him had burned up the day Catherine died, giving birth to their son, 3 hours of life, then stillness. They were buried together on the back hill behind the ranch house he built for dreams that never got born. He'd told himself he didn't have anything left to give. But now down there, a little girl was dragging her feet across the dry earth, one hand clutching something close to her chest. She fell once, scrambled up, fell again, and still she kept going. "Damn it," James muttered. He turned Midnight sharply and clicked his tongue. The horse responded without question, thundering down the slope in a controlled gallop. Dust kicked up around them as they flew down the ridge, drawing closer with each stride. James's heart pounded not with fear, but something deeper, some old part of him cracking open again. The prairie blurred past. The child came into view fully now. A girl, maybe 8 or 9. Her dress hung off her like wet paper. Her bare feet were bleeding. She staggered, then crumpled forward. This time she didn't get up. James yanked Midnight to a halt and dismounted in one motion. His boots hit the earth with a thud. He dropped the reins and strode forward, keeping his steps' measured voice low. "Hey there," he called. "It's all right. You're safe." The girl's head jerked up. Her face was streaked with dust, her lips cracked and bleeding, eyes wide and dark as river stones. "Please don't hurt me," she rasped. "I won't. I swear it." He crouched, holding his hands out, palms up. "Name's James Coulter. I've got a ranch not far from here. I saw you from up on the ridge." She blinked hard. Her arms were wrapped tight around a battered doll. One button eye. Stained dress. Homemade. The kind a mother would make when money ran thin. James took a breath and stayed still. "What's your name, Nina?" she whispered. "Nina Wakasa." Her voice shook as much as her body. The wind tugged at her hair. Her legs twitched like she was trying to get up again, even though she couldn't. He moved forward an inch. "All right, Nina. Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Just tired, thirsty." Her eyes filled with tears. "Yes." James reached into his saddlebag and pulled out his canteen. He unscrewed it and offered it gently. "Here, small sips. Don't gulp." She took it with trembling hands and drank like she hadn't in days. Some of the water spilled down her chin. She wiped it with her sleeve and handed the canteen back, fingers sticky. James watched her, something twisting in his chest. "Where's your folks, Nina?" "My papa's dead." Her voice was almost inaudible. 6 weeks ago. It was sickness. We were with a wagon train." James nodded. He'd seen it happen more than once, families heading west with too much hope and not enough luck. "What about your ma?" She looked away. "Ma? My real mama died before. My stepmother." He waited. Nina's mouth opened, then closed. Finally, she said, "She left me." James's jaw tightened. "Left you where? Here?" She looked around. "Said I was dead weight. Said she was done." He breathed in slow through his nose. Fury climbed his throat, but he buried it. Nina didn't need that. Not now. "You've been walking all this way?" She nodded. "How long, I don't know." "All right." James stood. "You can't stay out here. You'll come with me. We'll get you food rest. There's someone at my place who can help. Her name's Miss Franny. She's tough, but she makes good biscuits." Nina's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. "I don't have money," she said. James almost smiled, but it hurt too much. "Lucky for you, I don't charge little girls for biscuits." Her lower lip quivered. She nodded once. "I'm going to lift you now," he said gently. "You'll ride with me. That okay?" She clutched her doll tighter. "Yes, sir." James picked her up carefully. She was light, too light. Bones and nothing. He carried her to Midnight and settled her in the saddle. She didn't even flinch at the movement, just leaned forward, head against the horse's neck. He mounted behind her, one arm around her waist. "Lean back, Nina. I've got you." The sun dipped lower as they rode toward the ranch. The sky turned lavender and gold. Nina didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her breathing slowed. Her body softened. She was asleep within minutes. James stared out across the prairie, the weight of the child pressed against him, her doll resting in her lap. Behind them, the wind carried nothing but silence. Ahead, the lights of the ranch waited, flickering warm in the coming dusk. This house ain't used to children, but maybe it remembers how. The ranch house stood solid and wide in the fading dusk, all warm lamplight, and the smell of wood smoke curling from the stone chimney. James guided Midnight into the yard, the child still limp in his arms, her doll cradled tight between them. Franny McBride stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron brows, already knitting with sharp concern. Her hair was wound up tight in its usual braid, and her boots thudded heavy across the floorboards. "You're late," she called, but her tone changed the second she saw what he carried. "Lord above, what in God's name is that?" Not what James said, quietly easing down from the saddle. "Who?" Franny moved forward fast, her years forgotten in the urgency of her steps. She saw the girl and sucked in a breath. "She alive, she is," James said. I found her out near Bison Ridge, on foot, alone." Franny's hands went to her hips. "What fool leaves a child in the middle of nowhere, her stepmother?" he said grimly. "Left her to die." Franny's face twisted in a way that said she'd save her cussing for later. "Bring her inside. Get her warm. You've got no business standing out here jawing while she fades." James didn't argue. He stepped up the porch and crossed the threshold with Nina curled against him, like a bundle of broken sticks. Her breathing was light and shallow, her lips dry as parchment. The house smelled of stew and fresh biscuits. The fire in the hearth threw soft orange light across the wooden floor. James carried Nina to the guest room on the first floor, a room that had stayed empty since the day he nailed the door shut, on dreams he didn't dare open. Franny was already there ahead of him, turning down the quilt on the bed, her hands all motion and muttering. "Lay her here. Careful now." James did. The girl didn't wake, just curled tighter into herself, one hand still gripping her doll. Franny knelt beside the bed, studying the child, with a look that made James think of midwives and battlefield nurses, women who knew how to patch wounds no one else would touch. "She's feverish," Franny murmured. "Not sick fever, just sun and thirst. Poor thing's near burnt through." "I gave her water," James said. "She'll need more than that." Franny stood abruptly and pointed. "Out. You'll just be in the way." James hesitated. "She's not a calf that needs a pen, James. She's a child. Let me do my work." He nodded and backed out of the room. As the door clicked shut, he stood there in the hallway, hand on the frame, listening. He heard the splash of water, the rustle of linens, the low croon of Franny's voice, soft, steady, something between humming and prayer. He hadn't heard that sound in a long, long time. James walked into the parlor and stared at the fire for what could have been 5 minutes or 50. His knuckles were scraped from the ride. His chest ached like he'd been trampled. He poured a splash of whiskey, didn't drink it, just let it sit in his hand. A child. Here. In this house. He didn't know what to do with that. The last time he'd held a child, it had been his son, barely longer than a sigh. Catherine hadn't made it through the birth. And the boy Thomas had lived just long enough to be named and wrapped in a blanket that still sat folded in the top drawer of a dresser he hadn't opened in 10 years. The house hadn't heard small feet in all that time. And now a girl had arrived like a storm, sudden, unasked for, but impossible to ignore. The door creaked behind him. Franny stood there, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She's sleeping. Cleaned up and tucked in. Poor thing's skin and bones. James nodded, unsure what to say. Franny moved closer. "You did the right thing bringing her here." "I didn't plan to," he said. "Didn't even know I was going down that ridge until I was halfway there." Franny looked into the fire. Some things don't need planning. They just need doing. They stood like that a moment, the quiet of the house pressing around them. Outside, a coyote yipped far off. "What's she like?" Franny asked. "Name's Nina. Said her father died 6 weeks back." Stepmother threw her off the wagon, called her dead weight. Franny's jaw tightened. What kind of woman leaves a child to die? James didn't answer. He didn't need to. Franny moved to the table and picked up her knitting, though she didn't resume working it. Just held it in her lap. "She's gonna need food, clothes, boots. I'll ride into Bozeman. She'll also need something steadier than that doll she's got clenched in her fist. But we'll start with breakfast." James looked up. "You think she'll stay? She's got nowhere else," Franny said. "She's not ready to ask, but she's already hoping." James didn't answer right away. His hands curled tighter around the glass. "I'm not used to all this." Franny's voice was quieter now. "This house ain't used to children, but maybe it remembers how." He nodded once. "I'll keep her safe." "I know you will." Franny stood. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow she'll wake up scared out of her mind, and you'll need to figure out how to look like you know what you're doing." The next morning broke soft and pale through the kitchen window. Franny was already at the stove sleeves, rolled up dough under her fingernails. The scent of bacon and cornmeal filled the house. James pushed open the door to the girl's room. She was awake, propped up against the pillow's doll in her arms, eyes wide and wary. He stood in the doorway for a second too long. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she whispered back. "You hungry?" A nod. "We got biscuits and bacon if Miss Franny hasn't eaten it all." Another nod. She swung her legs over the bed, her toes barely brushing the floor. "Your name's Nina," he said. "That right?" "Yes, sir. I'm James. But you can call me whatever makes you feel safe." She hugged the doll tighter. Is this your house?" "It is." "Am I allowed to be here?" James crouched to meet her eyes. "You're not only allowed, you're welcome." She nodded again, this time a little faster. Her voice was small but steady. "Thank you, Mr. James." As they walked toward the kitchen, Nina hesitated at the threshold. Franny turned from the stove, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave the girl a nod that meant she was already part of the place, even if no one had said it out loud yet. The morning light caught the dust in the air, turning it gold, and for the first time in a long while the old house didn't feel empty. Scars don't lie, James, but they don't have to stay open. Franny stood still in the hallway, her hand curled around the doorknob of the washroom, her face pale with quiet fury. James knew that look. He'd seen it once when a neighbor beat his dog near to death. Franny had stepped in then, same as now, because some things you just didn't look away from. "She's covered in them," she said, voice low. "Arms, back, welts, bruises, some half-healed, some not." James didn't speak. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing as the fire in his gut turned to stone. She flinched when I touched her shoulder to brush out her hair. Just a hand on her dress, and she near jumped out of her skin. He looked past her to the washroom door. Beyond it, the girl sat in a tub of warm water, steam curling around her like a thin fog, her knees drawn tight to her chest. The doll waited on the bench, wrapped in a clean towel, its missing eye stitched back on with black thread. "What kind of woman beats a child like that?" Franny asked. "The kind that calls her dead weight and leaves her to die," James said flatly. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, a crow cawed from the barn roof, and the wind rattled the edge of the shutter. "She let me wash her hair," Franny said more softly. Didn't speak, but she didn't cry either. That's the worst of it. Like she figured out a while ago that crying don't change a thing. She said her stepmother started after her papa died. Sounds like he tried to protect her when he was still breathing. Franny's mouth turned tight. Men like that get buried, and women like her keep walking. God's got a funny way of sorting things sometimes. James didn't argue. She'll need salve, Franny continued for the marks. And new clothes. She's so skinny I could tie her to a fence post and she'd slip through. I'll head to town, James said. Tomorrow. Franny gave a short nod. Good. She turned back to the washroom and opened the door with care. All right now, sugar, she called gently. Let's get you dried off. I set out one of my old nightshirts. It might drown you a little, but it'll be soft. Nina's voice came back barely above a whisper. Thank you, Miss Franny. James walked outside into the late morning sun. The barn door creaked as he stepped through. The smell of hay and leather wrapped around him. He busied himself with the tack brushing down Midnight's coat, cleaning the bit, oiling the saddle straps. But his hands moved without thought. That little girl had marks on her that told a story no child should carry. She hadn't told it in words, but her back had done the talking. Each scar a sentence, each bruise a broken paragraph. He'd never laid a hand on a child in anger, never could imagine doing it. And yet he knew men and women who did, who raised fists instead of voices, belts instead of reasons. He'd grown up near enough to it, had the sense to leave that part of his life behind. Midnight snorted and nudged his shoulder. James patted the horse's neck. She's tougher than she looks, he murmured. But Lord help me, I want to ride after that wagon and make sure that woman never lays a hand on her again. His voice cracked just a little at the end. That afternoon, Nina sat on the back steps with a blanket around her shoulders, the sun warming her cheeks. Franny had combed out her hair, braided it into 2 neat plaits. Her skin looked less gray, though her eyes stayed wary, watching every movement. James brought her a mug of warm milk. She looked at it, then him. It's safe, he said gently. I didn't say it wasn't, she replied, but she sniffed it before sipping. Franny chuckled from inside the kitchen. Where's your doll? James asked, sitting a few feet away. She's sleeping, Nina said. She's tired from the road. That makes 2 of you. Nina looked out over the yard. Chickens pecked near the fence and the windmill creaked as it turned. The world felt bigger than she remembered, and quieter. My daddy used to take me fishing, she said suddenly. James looked at her. He said I was better at it than most boys. I used corn on the hook 'cause I didn't like hurting worms. He smiled faintly. Sounds like a good man. He was. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then he got sick, and she got meaner. She used to whisper things at night, things I shouldn't say out loud. James didn't press. Didn't need to hear them to know. I tried to make her like me, Nina added, softer now. I did chores. I kept quiet. I never cried when she hit me. I thought if I was good enough, maybe she'd keep me. James felt that twist in his gut again. You were already good enough, he said. She just wasn't. Nina blinked at him like no one had ever said that to her before. I'm not going back, she said, even if she comes looking. You're not, James said. You're safe here. They sat in silence after that. The wind carried the scent of sage and dry grass. Somewhere across the fields, a cow lowed. Inside, Franny set to mending a pair of old boots small enough to fit a child's feet. She measured them against her own hands and began stitching a new inner lining, humming under her breath. James watched Nina pick at the hem of her blanket, and something shifted in him, not sudden, not loud. Just a click like a door unlocking after being stuck for years. She wasn't his, but she was here, and that meant something. That evening, James lit the oil lamp in the parlor and pulled out the ledger where he tracked livestock and grain. Nina appeared in the doorway, still in the oversized nightshirt, holding her doll. "Can I sit here?" she asked. "Of course." She curled up on the rug near the fire, her doll in her lap head, leaning against the armchair. James watched her eyes flutter closed. "Miss Franny said we might go outside tomorrow," she mumbled. "She said you got horses." "I do. I never got to ride one." He smiled softly. "Maybe it's time you learned." She nodded, eyes shut now, breathing steady. As the flames danced in the hearth and the house settled into the quiet of night, James sat with his ledger open and didn't write a word. Somehow a girl had walked into his life with bruises and silence and a broken doll, and she was changing everything. And somehow that felt right. She's not just hungry for food, she's starving for place. The early light slid across the plains like spilled milk, cold and thin. James rode out before the sun fully broke his saddle, creaking beneath him, as midnight trotted toward the cottonwoods near the creek. His coat was lined, but the wind still cut through like it had something to prove. The kind of wind that didn't just chill your skin, it whispered to your bones. He needed to see Red Elk. Not because the man had answers, but because he always knew how to ask the right questions. Red Elk had been a scout for the army back when Montana still boiled with tension. Now he lived alone in a small lodge tucked into a grove west of the Coulter Ranch, carving antler tools and smoking herbs that smelled like pine and pepper. He didn't speak unless it mattered. James trusted him for that very reason. He tied Midnight loosely to the post and walked the last few yards. Smoke curled from the chimney. The door creaked as he knocked, though he figured Red Elk already knew he was coming. The man could hear a lizard blink. "It's open," came the deep, flat voice. James stepped inside. Red Elk sat cross-legged by the fire, whittling something from bone. His hair was long-streaked gray and tied with rawhide. A beaded band crossed his forehead. He wore a heavy wool shirt and leggings, the cuffs stitched with tiny horse tracks. James tipped his hat. "Morning." Red Elk didn't look up. "You never come early unless something's wrong." James sat down on the opposite side of the fire, the heat biting into his cold fingers. "I found a girl," he said. Red Elk paused his carving. Alive, just barely. About 9 years old. She was walking alone. No wagon, no kin. Said her stepmother left her after her father died. Red Elk nodded once. "And you took her home?" "Didn't see any other choice." "You did." James frowned. "You saying I shouldn't have, I'm saying you had a choice. And you chose the harder road." Red Elk laid the bone down and looked James square in the eye. Why James ran a hand through his beard. "I don't know. She looked so small out there. Like she was trying to keep herself from disappearing. She didn't cry, not once. Children don't cry when they stop believing someone's listening." James stared into the fire. "She's been hurt," he said after a while. "Whipped, I'd guess." Franny found the marks. Said she jumped like a skittish colt just from having her hair brushed. Red Elk grunted softly. "Pain doesn't live in the skin, it lives in the story. She doesn't talk about it much. She doesn't need to, she's told you enough." Red Elk picked up the carving again, his hands steady. "What she needs now is not food or medicine. She needs place. Place, not just a roof, not just a bed. She needs to know she belongs, that her being there changes the shape of things." James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "How do I do that?" Red Elk's eyes twinkled faintly. You already are. James shook his head. It doesn't feel like it. I don't know the first thing about raising a child. I still can't even open the drawer where I put my son's blanket. She doesn't need a perfect father. She needs a steady man. One who sees her. One who stays. The words hit James hard like wind slamming a door. She asked me about the horses, he murmured. Said she's never ridden one. I was going to show her Honey today. Good. Red Elk reached into a clay jar and pulled out a bundle of dried herbs. Let her touch something big that won't hurt her. That's a start. James stood nodding. You'll come by soon, I will. Red Elk tilted his head. And James? Yeah. Don't wait for her to ask. Give her the things no one ever offered. James left with the scent of smoke and sage trailing behind him. The sun was high by the time he made it back to the ranch, its light softening the hard edges of the land. In the yard, Nina sat on the fence rail, her legs swinging the doll balanced beside her, like it might fall if she didn't watch it close. She turned when she heard Midnight's hooves. You were gone a long time, she said. James dismounted and tied the reins. Had something to check on. You been up long? Since breakfast. Miss Franny let me help with the chickens. She let you near her hens, that's trust. Nina grinned faintly. I didn't drop a single egg. He walked toward the barn and gestured with his chin. Come with me. Got something to show you. She slid down from the fence and followed bare feet quiet on the packed earth. Her braid bounced slightly with each step. Inside the barn, the light filtered down in dusty beams. The air smelled of hay and leather and old wood. James opened the stall door and led out a chestnut mare with a white star on her forehead. This here's Honey, he said. She's gentle, used to kids riding double. Nina's eyes widened. She's so pretty. James took her hand and placed it against the mare's neck. Honey nickered softly and leaned into the touch. She's soft, Nina whispered. She likes you. That's rare. She kicked a preacher once. Nina giggled. You ever been around horses before, he asked. Only in wagons. Never this close. Well, James said, reaching for the bridle, let's fix that. He helped her up, his hands strong and steady at her waist. She sat stiff at first, then slowly relaxed, as Honey shifted under her calm and unbothered. James led the mare in a slow circle, his hand on the reins, his eyes on the girl. She sat taller with each pass. Her eyes were wide, but this time with wonder, not fear. I'm riding, she whispered. You are. I didn't think I ever would. You can do more than you think, Nina. When they finished, he helped her down. She stumbled a little and laughed. That was scary, she said, breathless. But good. James crouched to meet her eyes. Scary and good go together sometimes. She nodded. Will you teach me more every day if you want? She didn't say thank you, but he saw it in her face, in the way she stood a little closer and how she didn't flinch when his hand touched her shoulder. That night, as the sun sank low, Franny watched them from the porch. James holding the reins, Nina brushing Honey's flank, both framed in fading gold. She's not just healing, Franny whispered to herself. She's blooming. Inside, Red Elk's words echoed in James's mind. She's starving for place. And for the first time in a long while, he believed he might just be able to give her one. There's more healing in dirt and sun than in any sermon I ever heard. Nina stood barefoot in the garden, a wide straw hat sliding down over her ears, her hands deep in the soil. Franny watched her from the porch, rocking slowly, knitting needles clicking in rhythm with the birdsong. The girl's braids were half undone, one of them hanging sideways where she'd tried to fix it herself, and her dress bore streaks of tomato vine and mud. But her face had color again. Her arms didn't flinch when someone moved too fast. And that doll of hers, cleaned and mended, now had a cloth sash tied across its chest, like a badge of honor. Franny smiled to herself and stood stretching her back before walking down the steps. "You're planting those onions crooked," she said without real heat. Nina wiped her hands on her skirt and stood up straighter. "They won't care. They grow underground. They'll care plenty when I'm trying to pull them, and they're twisted up like a bird's nest." Nina grinned, unfazed. "I like planting stuff." Franny squatted beside her, knees creaking. "You ever planted anything before? Just beans in a jar with a paper towel?" It was for a lesson. But the wagon tipped and it got smashed. "Well," Franny said, patting the dirt, "these beans here don't need a jar. Just your hands and a bit of patience." Nina looked thoughtful. "If I grow something, that means it's mine, doesn't it?" "It sure does." Nina turned back to the dirt. "I want them to grow real tall." "They will," Franny said. "You take care of something, it'll show up for you." The sound of hooves echoed across the yard, and Nina froze, her fingers still curled around a small garden spade. James rode in from the northern fence line, leading an extra horse behind him, a tall black gelding with white socks. "Is that Red Elk?" Nina asked, squinting. "It is," Franny said. "Don't stare too hard. He sees more than most folks and doesn't miss a thing." Red Elk dismounted in one smooth motion, bones creaking but precise. His long hair was braided back today, and he carried a small leather pouch in his left hand. "Good morning," James called, tipping his hat. Red Elk nodded toward Nina. "I came for her." Nina stiffened and stepped slightly behind Franny. "For me?" she asked warily. "I have something to show you." Franny looked down at Nina. "Go on. He won't bite." James smiled. "Not unless you try to cheat him at cards." Red Elk waited until Nina reached him, then handed her the pouch. She opened it slowly and pulled out a bundle of dried flowers, lavender, wild mint, and sweetgrass woven together into a small loop. "What is it?" she asked. "A circle for your room," he said. "You hang it above the bed. It keeps away the bad dreams." She held it delicately, her voice low. "You made it for me," he nodded once. She blinked hard, then whispered, "Thank you." Red Elk turned and walked toward the back pasture. "Come," he said. "We will walk." Nina glanced at James. He nodded. She followed. The two of them walked in silence past the corral and toward the hill beyond the barn, where the wind never stopped moving and the grass grew in long waves. From a distance, Franny and James watched them, her small frame beside his taller one, both silhouetted against the wide Montana sky. "He's good with her," Franny said. "He understands quiet better than anyone I know," James replied. "You think she'll open up to him? I think she already has." Red Elk stopped at the top of the rise and sat cross-legged. Nina copied him. They sat facing east. "You were not always scared," he said. She shook her head. "No, but now you are." She nodded. "Tell me about the first time." She hesitated, then whispered, "The night my daddy died. He coughed so much he couldn't breathe. I tried to give him water, but it just ran down his chin. I sat by the fire and held his hand until it got cold." Red Elk listened without moving. "After that, she started hitting me. Said I was loud. Said I was dirty. She broke my doll once, but I fixed it." My papa said if something breaks and you love it, you fix it. Red Elk let the wind answer for a while. You fixed yourself too, he said at last. Nina looked down. Sometimes I think I'm still broken. He touched his chest. We are all cracked. That is where the sun gets in. She smiled faintly. Franny says I'm blooming. She is right. You're blooming like sage after rain. They walked back together, Red Elk humming something low and old, a melody with no beginning and no end. At supper, Nina helped set the table. She counted the forks out loud, tapping each one against the wood, one for me, one for Miss Franny, one for Mr. James, one for Red Elk. James raised an eyebrow. Planning to keep him here. She shrugged. He might as well stay. The chickens like him. Franny nearly dropped the stew ladle from laughing. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the day bled out into stars. Nina lay stretched across the swing, the dream circle Red Elk made already hung above her bed. Her head rested on Franny's lap, and her doll was tucked between her arm and chest, like it had always belonged there. James leaned against the railing, sipping coffee. She's changing, he said. Franny ran her hand through Nina's hair. We all are. James glanced toward the barn. The horses were quiet. The windmill creaked once. The sky was so wide it felt like it might swallow everything. She's starting to laugh again, he said. Laughter's proof something inside didn't die, Franny murmured. Nina stirred. I'm not asleep, she said. No one said you were, Franny replied. I was just resting my eyes. Well, rest them deeper, sugar. Big day tomorrow. What's tomorrow? James smiled. Maybe we ride out farther. Show you the creek. There's catfish under the rocks. Will you teach me to catch 'em only if you promise not to use corn? I like corn. We'll work on it. Her voice trailed off as sleep pulled her under. Franny whispered, She's home now. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The porch light flickered once the stars blinked overhead, and the sound of Red Elk's low humming rose again from the pasture, soft as smoke, steady as time. Even the smallest root will fight to stay in the soil when the wind comes howling. It started with hoofbeats. James was in the north pasture checking the boundary fence with Milo Harper, his ranch hand, when the distant sound came rolling in fast, hard, and wrong. The kind of rhythm that didn't belong to grazing cattle or ranchers riding the line. This was sharper, urgent. Milo stood up from where he'd been hammering a loose post. Someone's coming hard. James pulled the brim of his hat down and turned toward the ridge. A rider broke into view seconds later, his horse foam-slick and panting, the man's coat flapping behind him like a flag in a storm. Trouble, Milo asked. James didn't answer. He was already moving. They met the rider halfway near the split in the trail. The man slowed just enough to swing down and pull a crumpled piece of paper from his satchel. Name's Finch, he said between breaths. I ride the mail circuit out of Billings. Got word you might want to see this. James took the paper. It was a flyer. Torn edges, ink smudged in places. At the top, missing or stolen child. Below that, a name, Nina Wicasa. His stomach dropped. There was a rough sketch, dark braids, thin frame, and that doll unmistakably drawn beneath her arm. The description said the child was last seen fleeing a wagon caravan with a reward for information. Signed Agatha Wicasa. James stared at it, pulse hammering. When did this go out? Couple days ago, Finch said. Heard it was posted across a few towns west of here. But your name came up in Livingston. Milo swore under his breath. She's already sniffing around. She's calling it a family matter, Finch said. Tells folks you stole the girl. Says she's grieving. James folded the flyer tight and slow. His jaw locked hard enough to ache. She left that girl to die, he said. I watched her stumble across the prairie with nothing but a doll and a dry throat. Finch looked uneasy. Don't doubt you. But papers don't print the truth, they print the voice that's loudest. James nodded once. Appreciate the warning. Finch swung back into the saddle. You might not have long. If she's in Bozeman now, she'll keep moving. When the dust settled, James stood still for a long while, the paper clenched in his hand. Then he turned to Milo. You ride south. Tell Red Elk. Franny's got to know too. I'll get Nina. Milo took off without a word. James mounted Midnight and rode for the house, the wind gnawing at his collar. Nina was in the garden again when he got back, kneeling in the dirt, humming to herself. The doll sat propped against the fence post, wearing a new cloth vest Franny had stitched from scrap. James didn't call out. He dismounted and walked over slow. She looked up and smiled. I was going to surprise you. I planted more beans. James crouched beside her. Nina, he said, voice gentler than he felt. We need to talk. She blinked, reading his face. The smile faltered. Am I in trouble? No sugar. Not even a little. He held out the flyer. Her hands trembled as she took it. When she saw the sketch, her breath caught. That's me. Your stepmother's posted it in town. Says I took you. She's coming this way. Nina went pale. But I didn't run. She left me. She told me to die. I know. He took her hand. And I believe you. Everyone here does. But she's telling a different story, and some folks might listen. She pressed her face into his chest, voice muffled. She can't take me. Please don't let her. I won't, he said. No one's taking you off this land unless they drag me off first. Nina nodded, but didn't let go. Franny came outside a few minutes later, wiping flour from her hands. James met her eyes and nodded toward the porch. She followed him up the steps. He handed her the flyer. Damn her, Franny muttered. That lying snake. She's trying to use the courts, James said. Claims she's next of kin. She's no kin. Not in soul, not in blood. Girl's better off in a snake pit. She's dangerous, James said. Nina's scared stiff. We need to be ready. Franny stared out at the horizon. You thinking legal or something more permanent? James didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. That night the air grew heavy. Nina didn't speak during supper. She barely touched her cornbread. Franny baked her favorite apple crisp, but she only took one bite. When it came time for bed, she lingered on the porch swing, knees drawn to her chest. James sat beside her, silent. After a while, she whispered, she called me a burden. Said I took up space meant for someone better. He stared out into the dark. You remember the wildflower patch near the fence? She nodded. You know why they grow there? She shook her head. Because the cows avoid that spot. Too rocky. The soil's not easy. But those flowers they fight through anyway. Even the smallest root will stay in the soil when the wind comes howling. Nina looked up at him. So I'm a wildflower, he smiled. You're tougher than one. She leaned against him, and for a long time neither of them moved. Later, after she fell asleep with her doll curled under her chin, James stood by her doorway. Franny stepped up behind him. She's not going back. No, James said. She isn't. Franny's voice was low. We'll need to be careful. If that woman's coming, she won't come empty-handed. She's not getting through me. We might need help. James nodded. I'll ask Red Elk to stay closer. And I've got some friends in Bozeman, the kind who still believe in right and wrong. Franny looked at this girl sleeping peacefully, the moonlight soft on her bruises fading to yellow. She belongs here, she whispered. And James, with every fiber of his being, knew it was true. She came looking for a child. What she found was a family with roots deeper than fear. The dust cloud rose before the wagon ever cleared the ridge. James saw it first, high on the southern trail, just past where the prairie dropped into the gulch. A two-horse team pulling a black wagon with canvas sides and brass trim that gleamed sharp against the sun. Riding beside the driver sat a woman stiff as a poker, her posture carved from spite. Agatha Wakasa. He didn't move from the porch, just narrowed his eyes, chewing slow on a sprig of sweetgrass Red Elk had left behind. He felt Franny step up beside him, apron still dusted with flour. Her arms crossed over her chest. Well, she muttered, looks like the devil finally bought herself a decent pair of boots. James didn't answer. Nina was inside helping Red Elk grind herbs for poultices. She hadn't spoken much that morning, just moved around the house like she was trying to shrink small enough to disappear. Franny's voice dropped. You want me to keep her in the root cellar? No, James said. She's not hiding. Franny glanced at him. Then I reckon you better stand taller. He did. By the time the wagon rolled into the yard, dust coating the wheels like pale snow, James had one hand resting on the porch post, the other hanging loose at his side. Red Elk stepped out from the barn and leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. Milo came up from the lower field dirt, still on his hands, shotgun slung casual over one shoulder. No one said a word. Agatha climbed down like she expected applause. She wore a traveling dress, 2 shades too fine for this land, gloves white as bone, and a hat pinned with a feather that hadn't belonged to any bird west of the Mississippi. Her boots clicked sharp on the dirt. James Coulter, she said, voice sugar-laced but cold underneath. I assume you know why I'm here. I do, James said. But I think you ought to leave before your driver finishes watering those horses. Her jaw tightened. That girl belongs to me. She belongs to no one, Franny cut in. She's not a calf. Agatha's smile thinned. She's under my care. As next of kin. You abandoned her, James said. Left her in open country with no food, no water. If I hadn't found her, but you did. Agatha interrupted. Which puts you in the curious position of being a man who took something that wasn't his. She's not a thing, James said, stepping down from the porch. And she came here on her own 2 feet. You harboring her is illegal. I've spoken to a magistrate. Did you also show him the scars on her back? Agatha blinked. James took another step forward. I've seen the damage. Franny's seen it. You laid hand to that child and still think you've got the right to claim her. She's mine by law. She's safe by choice. Agatha's eyes flicked past him toward the house. Bring her out. Let her say it. No, I'm said. Agatha's voice rose. She's a child. She doesn't know what's best for her. She knows more than you ever gave her credit for. The door creaked open. All heads turned. Nina stood there in her best dress, one Franny had sewn from a bolt of blue calico. Her braids were neat, her doll tucked under one arm, the dream circle Red Elk made dangling on a string around her neck like a locket. Her chin was high, though her eyes trembled. She walked down the steps slowly. Franny reached for her, but Nina shook her head and moved past James. Agatha straightened. "Nina, come now. We'll go home. You've had your little adventure." Nina stared at her. "You told me to die." Agatha blinked, lips parting. "What you left me near Bison Ridge? You said I was a burden, that I wasn't your real blood." Agatha's voice pitched higher. "You misunderstood. I understood perfectly." Nina stepped closer, still holding her doll. "You didn't want me. You wanted to be rid of me. And now you want to look like a saint in front of men with pens and badges. You're a child. You don't know what you're saying." Red Elk's voice rolled out like thunder. "She knows." Agatha turned on him. "And who are you, another stranger corrupting her mind?" "Am the one who taught her to hear her own voice." Agatha's face twisted. "You'll regret this." James stepped between them. "No, you will." Milo moved forward, the shotgun no longer casual. "You've worn out your welcome." Agatha looked around. At the porch. At the barn. At the faces no longer indifferent. At the girl who no longer trembled when she stood up straight. She saw something she hadn't expected. Family. Not by blood, but by choice. By fire and food and fences mended together. By mornings with bread and quiet evenings full of trust, earned one look at a time. Agatha stepped back. "This isn't over." James didn't flinch. "It is for her." Agatha turned, climbed into the wagon, and didn't look back. The driver said nothing, just snapped the reins. They watched the dust trail vanish down the ridge. No one spoke for a long time. Then Nina let out a breath so deep it shuddered. James turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded, then whispered, "My knees are shaking." Franny swept her into a hug. "Mine too, sugar." Red Elk placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You didn't just hold the line. You planted it." That night the porch was quiet, except for the creak of the swing and the rustle of cottonwoods. The house behind them glowed warm with lamplight. Nina lay across the bench, her doll safe beside her, her eyes half closed. "She tried to act like she still owned me," Nina said. "She doesn't," James replied. "She didn't see it." "No," he said softly. "She came looking for a child. What she found was a family with roots deeper than fear. And in the hush of Montana night with the stars. Like lanterns overhead, James knew the worst had passed, but the real growing had just begun. A real home isn't a roof over your head. It's who opens the door when you're scared. The storm rolled in sudden and strange. Not the usual kind that swept low across the plains with a wall of gray and a warning howl, but a high, hot wind that spun the clouds like smoke. It came in the evening when the sun was still burning gold through the cottonwoods, throwing long shadows across the yard. James stood on the porch watching the sky twist. His gut had felt off since morning. Franny stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You feel that pressure dropped like a stone. Something's coming." "Dust storm." "Feels worse." Inside, Nina sat at the kitchen table with Red Elk sorting herbs into glass jars and humming quietly to herself. The door rattled in its frame once sharp enough to make her glance up. Red Elk's head tilted. "The wind is restless. Should we close the shutters soon?" Nina looked to the window. The horses were pacing near the fence. Honey stomped twice, ears pinned back. Red Elk murmured, "Animals always know first." James came inside fast, his boots tracking dust. Franny tied down the garden canvas. Nina, get your doll and your boots. Red Elk will need to bring the horses in. No one questioned him. The air tasted dry as ash. By the time the last saddle was stowed and the barn doors shut tight, the sky had turned a deep green, and the wind came in fits like something breathing heavy and mean. The house shuddered once as if bracing itself. Nina stood barefoot in the parlor, her doll tucked against her chest. James dropped to one knee beside her. "You ever been through a bad storm?" She shook her head wide-eyed. "It gets loud and it shakes things, but the house is strong. We're all here. You're safe. Even if it breaks something. Even then." She swallowed. "Promise, I promise." Thunder cracked like a whip and the lights flickered. Franny lit the lanterns quickly. Red Elk moved through the room, checking windows and laying thick blankets beneath the sills. When the rain finally hit, it came sideways, sheets of it slapping against the walls, making the porch groan and the roof hiss. The wind shrieked, ripping branches from the trees and hurling them like toys across the yard. They all sat close in the parlor. Franny crocheted, pretending calm. Red Elk muttered low chants under his breath. James cleaned his rifle, the motions steady, useless maybe, but grounding. Nina curled up beside him, trying not to flinch with every gust. "This isn't like the wind in the wagon," she whispered. "No," James said, setting the rifle down. "This wind isn't hollow. It's got a voice. What's it saying that it'll pass?" The house shook hard once, a rafter creaking so loud, James instinctively stood and checked the ceiling. Rain dripped down the chimney landing with soft plinks in the ash bin. Red Elk's voice was calm. "Storms don't care who you are. They just test how deep your roots run." Franny looked up. "That one hit close. Might want to check the roof when it's safe." Nina sat up straighter. "Can it get in? Not this time," James said. "We've patched every weak board since the thaw." She hugged her doll tight. "She's scared." "You can tell her it's all right to be scared," Franny said. "She's not made of iron." Nina looked at the doll. "You hear that? It's okay." A sudden clatter at the back of the house made everyone freeze. James reached for the rifle again and nodded at Franny. She stood slow and moved to Nina, drawing her close. James moved through the dark hallway, boots silent, every sense awake. Another sound, wood shifting. He threw open the kitchen door. The shed roof had peeled back like a sardine can. Tools scattered across the yard caught mid-flight. James exhaled and closed the door. Just wind. He returned to the parlor. "Shed's wrecked. We'll fix it tomorrow." Franny shook her head. "That old thing needed replacing anyhow." Nina's voice was quiet. "Does this happen every year?" "Not like this," James said. "But every storm passes." She pressed her cheek to his arm. "I'm glad I'm not alone." He looked down at her, something knotting in his chest. "You're not," he said. "Not anymore." The storm didn't ease until past midnight. When the wind died, it didn't taper, it just stopped, like something had run out of breath. The house held. In the morning, the yard was a mess. Shingles scattered, part of the chicken coop collapsed, but the fences were up and the animals safe. Red Elk helped mend the coop, while Milo dragged the shed doors from the pasture. Franny salvaged what herbs she could from the garden, most of them flattened or buried under mud. James found Nina by the back steps, barefoot again, her toes in the damp dirt. "You sleep okay?" she nodded. "Had a bad dream. But it went away." "Dream about what? Losing the roof. And you weren't there." He crouched beside her. "Well, I'm here, and the roof's mostly still up." She looked at him. "I wasn't really scared because I knew someone would open the door." He frowned gently. "What do you mean, in the dream?" "I knocked on the door while the wind blew, and it opened. I didn't even have to say anything." James stared at her a long moment. Then he smiled. "That's what home is." She grinned. "Even if the coop falls over. Especially then." They walked the fence line together later that afternoon. Nina picked up twigs and handed them to James for the burn pile. Each time she bent down, she checked the sky. It was blue again, wide, kind, and clear. At the far edge of the pasture, a wildflower bent, but didn't break. Nina knelt beside it and gently propped it up with a stick. James watched her for a while, his hands on his hips. She looked up. "It got knocked over. But it's still alive," he said. "It just needed help getting upright again." She stood and took his hand, and as they walked back toward the house with its patched-up roof and muddy porch steps, the wind behind them barely stirred the grass. The storm had passed, but the roots had held. Some folks earn the right to be called father not by blood, but by showing up when it matters most. James had never been one for fancy clothes, but this morning he wore his best shirt, the one with pearl buttons Franny had sewn back on twice. His boots were clean scuffed, but shined, and his face had the kind of shave that said something important was about to happen, even if no one spoke it out loud. The town of Three Forks was quiet when they rode in the sun, just beginning to edge past the rooftops. A few shopkeepers opened shutters and a boy swept dust from the steps of the barber's shop. Franny drove the wagon reins loose in her hands, while Nina sat between them, clutching her doll so tight the seams creaked. James rode alongside on midnight. Every few paces he glanced at Nina, offering small smiles meant to be steadying. She didn't smile back. Her mouth was drawn, her eyes wide as though afraid even to blink. Red Elk had stayed behind to mend the pasture gate. This part he'd said that morning, "You have to walk without me." They reached the courthouse just before the clerk unlocked the doors. The building was squat and square red brick with a whitewashed trim. A flag hung limp outside. Inside, the wooden benches squeaked under their weight. Nina sat still, her feet dangling. Her dress was neat hair braided tight. Franny brushed a stray strand from her forehead. James stood near the back hat and hand eyes on the empty doorway ahead. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. At precisely 9 o'clock, a door opened and Judge Alden entered the chamber. He was a stocky man with a deep voice and a mustache that twitched when he was thinking. He sat behind the bench, glasses low on his nose. "Mr. Coulter," he said, nodding. "Miss Franny. And this must be Nina." She looked up but said nothing. The judge shuffled papers. "We're here to discuss a guardianship petition filed by one James Coulter, citing the abandonment of minor child Nina Wicasa, known dependent of the deceased Elias Wicasa, and stepchild of Agatha Wicasa." "Is that correct?" James stepped forward. "It is." Judge Alden looked down over his glasses. "This, the same Agatha who came through town with her skirts too starched and her words too slippery." Franny gave a quiet cough that could have been a laugh. "Yes, sir," James said. "I've reviewed her claims and the affidavits you submitted. Also took the liberty of speaking with the sheriff in Livingston. He confirms the woman's been stirring up dust, mostly for show. Left town 2 days ago without contesting the hearing." James felt the knot in his stomach ease just slightly. The judge looked at Nina. "Young lady, do you know why you're here?" Nina glanced at James, then nodded. "Do you want to live with Mr. Coulter and Miss Franny?" She hesitated. "Yes." Can you tell me why? She swallowed. Because they didn't leave me. And they don't hit. And because they make room for me even when I don't talk much. The judge blinked once, then turned to James. That enough for you? James's voice came low. It's more than enough. Judge Alden stamped the document with a heavy hand. Then it's settled. Full guardianship granted. She's yours now in law and in fact. Franny let out a breath like she'd been holding it for years. James turned to Nina. You hear that? She nodded slowly, like the words were still traveling through her. Franny leaned down. You're ours, sugar. For good. They walked out into the bright morning, the sky wide and kind above them. Nina didn't say much on the ride back, but her hand stayed wrapped around James's the whole way, her thumb tracing the seam of his calloused palm like she was memorizing it. At the ranch, Red Elk waited by the barn. When they pulled up, he didn't ask, just nodded once and James nodded back. Franny climbed down first. I'll put on coffee. I'll help, Nina said, surprising them both. James stayed outside with Red Elk, watching the clouds drift soft and high. She's different, Red Elk said. She's not scared, James replied. Fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hides. James looked toward the house. She didn't hide today. That afternoon, they sat on the porch with lemonade and plates of warm cornbread. Milo came up from the lower fields and joined them. Nina sat cross-legged in the swing, humming softly. You ever think, she said suddenly, how names work? James looked over. What do you mean, like, when do you get to call someone your real family? Franny reached for her hand. I think you already do. Nina looked at James. Can I call you Pa? The word landed so softly it could have been missed, but it hit with the weight of a lifetime. James didn't speak at first. His throat worked around something too big for words. You can, he said finally. You sure can. She smiled, small and sure. Later, she stood by the fence line with her doll in one hand and a wildflower in the other. I'm going to plant this, she told Franny. Right by the porch, so it's close. Franny smiled. Flowers like to grow where there's love. Nina pressed the stem into the soil and patted the earth around it with careful fingers. I think this one'll stay. And as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the porch and painting the hills in quiet peace, the house behind them stood still and steady. Not just a shelter anymore, but a home real and true, where doors opened when the wind rose, where people stayed even when storms came, where a girl found her roots and chose her own name for love. There are kinds of silence that heal and kinds that kill. Learning the difference can save your life. The summer heat had settled like a blanket over the land, thick and still. Days moved slower now, mornings stretched long chores paced to match the sun, and the porch swing saw more hours than the barn. James had mended the fence by the south ridge twice just for the rhythm of it. Franny baked too much. Milo took to carving whistles out of scrap wood and leaving them around like breadcrumbs. But Nina was quiet. Not the nervous kind of quiet from before, when fear had shaped her voice into shadows. This was something else, thicker, heavier. A silence that filled the corners and made the air hum with questions. She still did her chores, helped Franny with the dishes, rode with James to the creek and back. But her smile faded early in the day and didn't return. She'd sit by herself at dusk, barefoot in the grass, the doll on her lap, its once loved dress now dusty and limp. James noticed first. He waited 3 days before saying anything, then found her sitting on the porch rail, staring toward the hills. You're a storm brewing today, he said softly. She didn't turn. I don't feel like talking. I know, but I thought I'd sit here a while anyway. He didn't press, just sat beside her and watched the same hills. A hawk circled above the far pasture. Below, the cattle grazed lazy in the sun. From inside came the distant clink of dishes, Franny humming an old tune that used to make the church windows rattle. Nina finally spoke. Do people forget on purpose? James looked sideways. Sometimes. Is it bad if I want to forget her voice, Agatha's? Nina nodded. Her hands clutched the doll, but not the way she used to. Now it looked more like an anchor than a friend. He answered slowly. It's not bad, but it's not easy. I dream of her sometimes. Not her face, just the way her hand felt when it pulled my braid too hard, or the sound of her boots on the wagon floor. James exhaled. Those dreams will soften. I can't say when, but they will. Do you have dreams like that? He nodded. About my brother, about the war, about things I wish I'd done different. What do you do when they come? Sometimes I sit on this porch and wait for them to pass. Sometimes I talk about them. Sometimes I let Franny make me cornbread until I forget what I was afraid of. That made her smile, but only a little. Franny knows everything, Nina said. She knows the truth when it walks into a room, and she knows when to give you space. Nina leaned her head on his shoulder. I like the silence here, but sometimes I think I'm disappearing inside it. James stilled. There are kinds of silence that heal and kinds that kill. Learning the difference can save your life. She nodded like she already understood. The next day, James asked Red Elk to walk with her. Not to fix her, but to give her a new place for her thoughts to go. They headed out early past the garden rows and into the open fields where the grass whispered secrets only Red Elk seemed to hear. Nina followed him barefoot, her doll left behind on the porch for the first time in weeks. They didn't talk for a long time. Finally, she asked, Do you ever stop feeling sad? Red Elk kept walking. I don't try to. She blinked. You don't want to stop. Sadness is a place. Sometimes it's a doorway. Sometimes it's a room. Sometimes it's the earth you walk on until something new grows. She chewed on that in silence. They reached the creek and sat by the edge, toes in the water. Red Elk pulled a stone from his pocket and handed it to her. It was smooth and flat, warm from the sun. This was in the river a long time, he said. Tumbled until its sharp edges softened. She ran her fingers over it. Like me, she asked. He nodded. She closed her hand around the stone. It still feels strong. It is. That evening she came back different. She didn't say much, but her eyes had a shape. James recognized someone who'd walked through something and was still walking, even if her legs trembled. Franny noticed too. She's found her footing again. James nodded. One day at a time. Later that night, Nina sat in her room and opened the box Red Elk had given her. Inside was a small pouch of dried sage, a sprig of sweetgrass, and a square of deerskin. She'd asked him what it was for. To make space for your truth, he'd said. Now she placed the stone inside, added a strand of her braid she'd clipped herself, and tied it shut. She placed the pouch beside her doll and whispered, We're not made of the same things anymore. She didn't mean it cruelly. She just meant she had changed. Outside, the wind picked up. James stood on the porch, eyes on the stars. When she came out, bare feet pattering across the wood, he turned. Couldn't sleep, he asked. Didn't want to. He stepped aside and she climbed into the swing beside him. They rocked for a while. Can I tell you something? Always. I don't remember what my father's voice sounded like, just the way his coat smelled, like horses and tobacco. That's still remembering. She nodded. I don't want to forget him, just the things that hurt too much. He looked at her so small and solid in the dark. Then you hold on to the smell of his coat. Let the rest go when it's ready. She leaned against him. I think the silence is softer now, she said. James smiled. It's because you're not alone in it. And under the sky stitched with stars, the silence wrapped around them, not heavy, not hollow, but full of things growing unseen. Things she would one day name. Home is not where you came from. It's where someone stays even after the worst part of you shows. Autumn arrived slow that year, like it was being careful not to disturb anything too fragile. The first frost kissed the tips of the grass before retreating, and the trees turned a shade softer than fire, as if even they knew that peace here had been hard won. Nina stood in the doorway with her hands cupped around a steaming tin cup. She wasn't small anymore. Her braids had grown longer. Her voice had a steadiness to it that hadn't been there before, the kind that came from soil and sweat, not just age. Behind her, Franny clattered in the kitchen, humming the same old hymn she always did when she cooked apple butter. Outside, James hitched the wagon loading the last basket of harvest goods for the county fair. The fairgrounds sat just past the ridge where the land opened wide, and folks came from towns all across the territory to trade dance and tell stories. Nina walked out onto the porch and sat on the swing legs tucked beneath her, the cup warming her hands. James saw her and smiled. You're coming with us this year, right? She gave a half nod, eyes on the sky. Do I have to talk to people only if you want to? Good. I'd rather watch. James climbed the steps and sat beside her. The boards creaked under his weight. You know, he said you used to be scared of the porch swing. I thought it would break. You didn't trust it. I didn't trust anything. He let the quiet settle. She looked at him. What if I still don't know how to be someone's daughter? You already are. But I get angry, or quiet, or strange. What if I don't always know how to show it? James tilted his head, thoughtful. You think I'm easy to live with? She smirked. You're not. I leave boots in the hallway, snore like a freight train, and get mean when I'm worried. But you stay. I do. That's what home is, Nina. Not where you came from. It's where someone stays even after the worst part of you shows. She looked down into her cup. Even when I break things, especially then. The fair buzzed with life when they arrived, steam rising off fry bread stands, fiddles tuning up on the stage, children chasing each other between horses and wagons. Nina stayed close to Franny, her doll tucked into the crook of her arm like it belonged there all over again. They didn't enter her in any contests. James didn't make her perform or recite or show off. They just walked the rows together. Franny buying spools of thread, Milo grumbling about prices, Red Elk greeting other tribesmen with quiet nods and warm clasped hands. Near the end of the afternoon, James spotted a booth where a photographer had set up under a canvas shade. The camera stood tall on its tripod. Black cloth draped behind it like a theater curtain. You ever had your picture taken? He asked Nina. She shook her head. You want to? She hesitated, then nodded once. Franny stood beside her and James stepped in too. Red Elk joined at the edge, one hand on Nina's shoulder. The photographer fussed over angles and light, but James didn't care. When the shutter clicked, Nina didn't smile, but her chin was lifted, and her eyes looked straight ahead, like she belonged to the land behind her and the people beside her. Later, James slipped the small printed photo into his vest pocket close to his heart. On the ride home, Nina leaned against him. "That man said pictures last forever," she murmured. "Some things do," he replied. Back at the ranch, the wind had picked up again, crisp and sweet. Red Elk returned to the cabin. Milo turned in early, saying something about needing to fix the plow by daylight. James and Nina sat on the porch while Franny lit the lanterns inside. The light flickered through the windows, throwing golden shapes on the floorboards. Nina pulled something from her pocket. The pouch Red Elk had given her. "I think it's time," she said softly. "For what to bury it?" She led him past the porch, down toward the patch of earth, near the garden, where wildflowers still clung to life in the cool air. She knelt and dug a shallow hole with her hands. Then she placed the pouch inside. "For the things I don't want to carry into next year." James knelt beside her. "You don't have to forget to move on, I know. I just don't want to feed it anymore." They covered it with dirt. She pressed her palm to the earth. When she stood, James saw something different in her eyes, not defiance, not survival, but peace, earned peace. "I still have questions," she said. "You'll always have them, and I still get scared. So do I." She took his hand. "But I think this is my home now. I believe it." His voice came low, full. "So do I." Inside, Franny called them in for supper. They walked back together. No rush. Nina looked up at the sky. "I hope it snows this winter," she said. James laughed. "I hope not. It's pretty. It's cold. I've never had a real snowball fight." "Well," he said, opening the door for her, "sounds like we better get ready." She stepped inside, light wrapping around her like a promise. Behind her, the land stretched wide and strong, but it no longer felt like something to run from or fear. It felt like hers, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't wonder what came next. She just lived.